In a previous video, I went over the basic ideas in Plato's philosophy and mentioned that we would continue exploring his thought in the next one. We will do that, but at the same time, I've been working on a video that looks at the Presocratics as a group. While I've already covered several of these early thinkers individually, I thought it would be useful to bring everything together in a single video. That way, we can get a clearer view of that early period in Western philosophy before moving on to figures like Plato and Aristotle. What defines the Presocratic movement is a turn toward rational thinking and logical inquiry, stepping away from myth and story-based explanations. This transition would go on to shape the entire tradition of Western thought. That said, grouping these thinkers under a single term like Presocratic can be problematic. They came from different places, lived in different contexts, and pursued a variety of questions. To refer to all of them under one name risks glossing over their individuality. Even when they touched on similar themes, it might be more appropriate to give them distinct group names. This has happened, for example, with the Milesians, but such groupings are often treated as just subsets within the broader category of Presocratic philosophy. There are also complications from a historical angle. For example, Democritus, an important figure known for his atomic theory, is often classified as a Presocratic, even though he lived at the same time as Socrates. So, using the label Presocratic should always come with some caution. Still, despite the challenges in terminology and classification, it's clear that these early thinkers played a crucial role in setting Western philosophy into motion. None of the works of the Presocratic thinkers have reached us in complete form. In some cases, we have nothing directly from them at all. What we do have comes down in two main forms: fragments and testimonies. The fragments are believed to be the actual words of these early thinkers, taken from what may have once been books or simply recorded sayings. But no full works survive, not even small, intact compositions. This is not unique to the Presocratics. No original texts exist even from later figures like Plato or Aristotle. Before printing existed, manuscripts were copied by hand, and the texts we now possess are the results of repeated copying over time. Because of this, even the so-called fragments might not fully preserve the precise meaning or language of the original thinkers. The testimonies, on the other hand, come from later authors, ancient writers who quoted or discussed the Presocratics. These include figures like Plato and Aristotle, both of whom explicitly name and sometimes elaborate on earlier thinkers. But it's important to remember that they had their own philosophical aims, and their interpretations of earlier thought may reflect those aims more than they reflect the original views. In Plato's case, he wrote in a dramatic and literary style, creating dialogues that likely shaped how the Presocratics were presented to suit the themes of his work. Aristotle, though he wrote in a more systematic and analytical style, also discussed earlier philosophers mainly in relation to the topics he himself was exploring. He would often lay out the views of his predecessors as a lead-in to his own positions. In these cases, especially where he disagreed, there's always the possibility that he may have distorted or simplified their arguments in order to strengthen his own case. So while the works of Plato and Aristotle provide valuable information, we have to approach them with critical caution. Although they aren't truly a philosophical school in the strict sense, the thinkers we group as the Milesians do share more than just a place of origin. Coming from the Ionian city of Miletus, located in what is today Turkey, figures like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes are considered to be the first to depart from the mythological and poetic frameworks of earlier traditions like those found in Homer and Hesiod. While we don't consider these early figures philosophers in quite the same way we do Plato and Aristotle, they were nonetheless engaged in deep inquiry. Their work was focused on understanding the origins and structure of the cosmos, and they approached these questions using natural reasoning. The location of Miletus is also significant. It was a port city, open to cultural exchange and travel. Someone like Thales, for instance, may have journeyed to places like Egypt or Babylon. There is strong evidence that knowledge from these older civilizations, particularly in fields like astronomy and mathematics, influenced early Greek thought. When considering what the Presocratics contributed to subjects such as science and mathematics, it's important to recognize that they were not isolated geniuses. The discoveries attributed to them were likely built on older knowledge, and it's often hard to say who discovered what with any certainty. Often regarded as the first philosopher in Western history, Thales of Miletus emerges from a cloud of legend and colorful anecdotes. Ancient sources offer stories that blur the line between fact and myth. Herodotus recounts that Thales once advocated for unifying the Ionian cities under a single council, aiming to consolidate political power and forge a common identity. In another tale from a military campaign, he is said to have redirected the course of the Halys River, enabling an army to cross safely without the need for a bridge. Aristotle provides a different kind of story, one that portrays Thales as a philosopher capable of defending the value of his craft. According to this account, Thales used his understanding of the heavens to foresee a particularly abundant olive harvest. Acting on this knowledge, he leased the local olive presses during the off-season at a low price, since no one else believed his prediction. When the harvest arrived and demand surged, he rented out the presses at high rates, turning a substantial profit. Aristotle's point was that philosophers could amass wealth if they desired, but their interests lie elsewhere. Plato offers a more humorous image of Thales, claiming that he once fell into a well while gazing at the stars. A sharp-witted Thracian servant girl mocked him, pointing out that while he was obsessed with what lay above, he was blind to what was right before him. This story would later become emblematic of the stereotype of the impractical philosopher, someone with great insight into abstract matters but little attention to everyday life. Although the historical truth of these anecdotes remains uncertain, they collectively portray Thales as both a man of action and of contemplation, an image that gained wide recognition among later thinkers. He is credited with predicting a solar eclipse that reportedly altered the course of a battle by catching the opposing side unprepared in the resulting darkness. Thales is also remembered for his influence on early Greek mathematics, especially geometry. He is associated with several fundamental geometric discoveries, such as properties of triangles and circles, and some believe he helped introduce geometric knowledge to Greece from Egypt. Thales' place at the beginning of the Milesian philosophical tradition is marked by a desire to find the underlying source of all things. He proposed that water was the fundamental principle, or arche, from which everything originates. Aristotle speculates on why Thales might have held this belief. Moisture appears essential to nourishment, and warmth seems connected with it. Seeds, which give rise to life, have a moist quality, and water is a key element in the growth of living things. While some later interpreters thought Thales believed water to be a component of all matter, the evidence suggests he more likely viewed it as the original source from which everything arises. It remains uncertain how literally to interpret Thales' idea of water as the foundation of the cosmos. What is clear is that he introduced a shift toward natural explanations without entirely discarding the divine. He is reported to have believed that all things are filled with gods, and that water itself is animated by a divine presence that imparts motion. If all things originate in water, and water is infused with divinity, then the world as a whole is alive and sacred in some sense. One source claims that Thales described the divine as the mind of the world, asserting that the cosmos is alive and teeming with deities, and that a divine force moves through the elemental moisture. In this way, Thales did not eliminate theology. He transformed it, merging it with a naturalistic view of the cosmos. Anaximander, often seen as continuing the legacy of Thales, and possibly having studied under him, applied his insights about the heavens to more immediate earthly concerns. He is credited with creating the gnomon, a basic form of sundial, and may have been responsible for introducing the Greeks to the concepts of solstices and equinoxes, along with the division of the day into 12 parts, knowledge likely influenced by contact with Babylonian astronomy. His explorations led him to acquire substantial geographical understanding, and he is believed to have produced one of the earliest known maps of the known world. In the philosophical tradition established by Thales, Anaximander also sought to identify a fundamental origin for all things. However, he departed from the idea of grounding the cosmos in any of the classical elements. Instead, he proposed the existence of the apeiron, the boundless or infinite, as the underlying source. Unlike tangible elements like water or fire, the apeiron was a more abstract and indefinite principle, perhaps because all the conventional elements seemed to transform into one another, suggesting that they must all emerge from something deeper and more primary. This boundless origin, eternal and inexhaustible, generated opposites such as hot and cold, which then separated out from it. Though the exact mechanism of this separation remains obscure, it was presumably a natural process inherent to the boundless itself. The cosmos, in Anaximander's view, is a continuous interplay of these elemental forces, splitting, merging, and transforming over time. In a poetic fragment attributed to him, Anaximander speaks of the boundless as the origin of all things and their final destination, stating that all entities pay reparation to one another for their injustices according to the order of time. This idea introduces an almost moral dimension to the natural order, a vision of the cosmos as governed by balance and restitution. Anaximander also proposed ideas about the origins of life that stand out as remarkably forward-thinking. Though it would be misleading to call him the founder of evolutionary theory, his thinking touches on themes echoed much later. He believed that human beings could not have always existed in their present form. Given the long period of care and development humans require, he reasoned that they must have originated from other animals better equipped to nurture the young. In particular, he suggested that humans came from fish or fish-like creatures, and that their early development occurred within moist environments. At some point, these early human forms were encased in shells, eventually matured, and then emerged onto dry land, where they lived for a brief time in altered form. Even if Anaximenes lived too late to have directly engaged with Anaximander, the intellectual connection between them is unmistakable. Like Anaximander, Anaximenes believed that all things are rooted in something boundless. However, while Anaximander conceived of this origin as an indefinite and abstract principle, Anaximenes made it more concrete by identifying it as air. For Anaximander, opposites like heat and cold emerged from the indefinite, giving rise to the natural world. Anaximenes, by contrast, saw air itself as the source of all transformation. Through the processes of rarefaction and condensation, air morphs into different forms. When rarefied, it becomes fire. When condensed, it turns into water. Further condensation yields earth and even harder substances like stone. From these come all living and non-living things. Anaximenes also saw air as divine in nature. Ancient sources such as Cicero and Aetius report that he identified air with divinity itself. Since air is unlimited, it has no origin or end point, constantly moving and shifting. It acts as the essential fabric linking all existence. A natural implication of this view touches on the human soul, which was traditionally equated with breath. For Anaximenes, the soul shares in the divine nature of air, suggesting that each person carries within them something sacred. As with the other thinkers from Miletus, Anaximenes did not turn to mythological narratives from Homer or Hesiod to explain the world. Instead, he and the other Milesians introduced a novel way of seeing reality, one that laid the foundation for what we might call a scientific mindset, however early its form. Though their explanations involved natural principles rather than mythic ones, the divine was still woven into the very fabric of the natural world. This shift in thinking marked a profound change in how the cosmos and the gods were conceived. It wasn't a denial of the divine, but a transformation in how divinity was understood. This new mode of thought found a further step forward in Xenophanes, who offered one of the earliest critiques of traditional ideas about the gods. A native of Colophon in Ionia, not far from Miletus, Xenophanes did not stay in his hometown but traveled throughout Greece as a wandering poet, eventually settling in the Western Greek world. His ideas were expressed in verse, which makes interpreting them more difficult, even though we possess more surviving lines from him than from all the Milesian thinkers combined. The poetic form and fragmentary condition of his work leave some uncertainty about his precise views. It's unclear how much contact Xenophanes had with Milesian philosophy, but like them, he questioned conventional religious thought. His challenges extended beyond theology to social criticism as well. One example of this is his disapproval of the excessive admiration for athletes, arguing instead that wisdom should hold the highest place of honor. He challenges the common notion that the gods should be glorified while simultaneously being shown engaged in meaningless battles, suggesting that such depictions are not worthy of esteem. More pointedly, he condemns the way poets ascribe to the gods all manner of immoral human behavior, theft, deceit, and adultery among them. According to Xenophanes, such representations stem from a deeply ingrained human habit of projecting our own nature onto the divine. People assume that gods must look and behave like humans, wearing human clothes, speaking with human voices, and possessing human bodies, despite the fact that the divine, in his view, is entirely unlike us in both form and thought. To illustrate the problem of anthropomorphism, Xenophanes imagines that if animals such as lions or cattle could create images of the gods, they too would shape them in their own likeness. In his view, divinity does not arise from mythic narratives, but from a deeper understanding that all things originate in the earth. While the origin of the earth itself remains unclear in his fragments, Xenophanes' broader message seems to suggest that God transcends all limited human depictions. When people craft different images of divinity, they are more likely reflecting themselves than uncovering anything true about the divine. Thus, to revere the gods rightly requires a refusal to portray them as glorified humans. But what, then, does Xenophanes believe God to be? His vision of divinity is difficult to place within clear categories. It remains uncertain whether he advocated for a single god alone or for one supreme god above others. He describes a deity as the greatest among gods and mortals, language that could imply either exclusive monotheism or a kind of hierarchy within a broader divine order. This god perceives, contemplates, and governs all things by the sheer force of thought. Unmoving and ever-present, he remains fixed in place, yet exerts influence over everything through his mind alone. Some later interpreters, such as Aristotle, claimed that Xenophanes imagined God to be spherical, perhaps a metaphorical way of capturing the deity's unity and uniformity. Still, even this divine figure is described in ways that might inadvertently reflect human traits. When Xenophanes attributes to God the faculties of thought, hearing, and vision, he does not clarify how these claims are justified. We are left wondering whether this too is a subtle form of anthropomorphism. Xenophanes offers no definitive answer. What is clear, however, is that his conception of God breaks radically from earlier poetic traditions, initiating a new approach to theology grounded in reflection and critique rather than inherited mythology. At the heart of Xenophanes' thinking is the idea that ultimate truth about the gods, or indeed about anything at all, may remain forever beyond our grasp. Even when we speak about events in the world with some success, we still do so within the bounds of opinion rather than knowledge. Yet this acknowledgement of uncertainty does not lead to resignation. Instead, Xenophanes promotes a process of inquiry that, while cautious and undogmatic, still seeks deeper understanding. If he is to be considered a skeptic, then it is a skepticism that invites exploration rather than shuts it down, a stance that allows him to venture reasoned reflections on divinity without claiming final authority. The influence of Pythagorean thought left a deep and lasting mark on ancient philosophy, even though little is known with certainty about Pythagoras of Samos. His life is shrouded in myth and mystery. What can be said with some agreement is that he left his birthplace and settled in Croton, where he attained notable political influence. Yet his true legacy lies not in politics, but in the almost spiritual devotion he inspired, perhaps because of his status and authority. The community that formed around him continued long after his death, and later figures such as Philolaus of Croton offer glimpses into the ideas that circulated under the Pythagorean name. Whether the group adhered to a fixed set of teachings remains uncertain, but it is evident that with Pythagoras and his followers, a new mode of thinking took shape, one that would eventually shape the trajectory of Plato's philosophy. Pythagoras is best known today for a geometric principle bearing his name, linking the sides of a right triangle in a precise relationship. Whether this insight originated with him or was passed on from Egyptian sources remains open to debate. Within his circle, Pythagoras was seen as a figure of almost divine stature. Some claimed that rational beings fall into three categories: gods, humans, and those of a higher order, like Pythagoras himself. Legends grew around him, of his body having a golden thigh, of rivers greeting him by name, and of his being seen in two distant cities at once. Empedocles even praised his visionary mind, declaring that he could perceive the unfolding of events across many generations. Among the beliefs most securely tied to Pythagoreanism is the doctrine of the soul's transmigration. In this view, the soul is immortal and journeys through a cycle of rebirth across all living forms, returning to human life only after countless transformations. A famous anecdote told by Xenophanes illustrates this. Upon hearing a dog cry out while being struck, Pythagoras urged the beating to stop, saying he recognized the soul of a deceased friend in its voice. This belief in cyclical return extended not just to souls but possibly to all things, suggesting a worldview in which everything that occurs has already happened before and will happen again. While the ethical and psychological implications of such beliefs remain somewhat opaque, certain practices and behaviors came to be strongly associated with the Pythagorean way of life. Notably, the Pythagoreans were known for their practice of silence. Their teachings were often passed on in veiled, enigmatic form, and it is unclear how rigidly their customs were enforced. Some were said to abstain from handling or consuming beans, possibly due to symbolic associations with reproduction or the underworld. Others were forbidden from sacrificing white roosters, as the color white signified purity and the rooster itself was sacred, acting as a herald of the dawn. The group also maintained a body of sayings known as the things heard, which fell into three types: definitions of what something is, declarations about what thing is the most of its kind, such as the wisest, and precepts about what should or should not be done. The oracle at Delphi, in their view, was linked to the Tetractes, a sacred symbol representing harmony, which fulfilled the first category of these sayings. Number was held to be the ultimate form of wisdom, with the act of naming things regarded as second in importance. Plato and Aristotle often linked the sacredness and wisdom of numbers, and with them harmony and music, to the Pythagoreans. For instance, the concept of the sacred 10 is revealed through the Tetractes, a figure that illustrates the holiness of this number. Within it, we observe a relationship among numbers that culminates in a unified shape, starting with the 1, which generates plurality or 2, and then adding 3 and 4 to reach a total that symbolizes the structure of the cosmos. The Pythagoreans recognized 9 visible heavenly bodies and proposed the existence of a 10th, called the counter-earth, to maintain cosmic balance. The Tetractes also encodes the fundamental musical ratios, such as the octave, fifth, and fourth, that correspond to harmonious intervals. In this way, the universe itself is conceived as a harmony, and Philolaus extended this idea to the soul, viewing it as a kind of harmony or microcosm within the greater cosmos. For Philolaus, more fundamental than numbers were the principles of the limited and the unlimited. Nothing within the cosmos, including knowledge, could exist without some form of limitation. Imagine a universe without any limits, a boundless mass of matter with no distinctions. Without boundaries, it would be impossible to gain any clear perspective or understanding. This perspective itself requires a limit. Further, all things that we can know possess number, which itself is categorized into 2 types, odd and even. Number functions as a kind of limiter, defining each entity as one distinct unit, separate from others. There is also evidence that some Pythagoreans recognized a broader system of opposites alongside the limited and unlimited, and odd and even. These included pairs such as unity and multiplicity, right and left, male and female, rest and motion, straight and bent, light and dark, good and evil, square and oblong. These opposites were arranged into two parallel groups, though exactly how remains unclear. Together, they were believed to reveal the fundamental nature of the cosmos and existence itself. Notice that these pairs number 10, with the concepts of limit-unlimited and odd-even appearing first, seen as the origins of everything else. Thus, the Pythagoreans envisioned a universe deeply numerical in essence, but also characterized by the dynamic tension of harmony and, like Heraclitus, the interplay of opposing forces. Just south of Colophon in Ionia lay Ephesus, a place where fresh philosophical ideas were taking shape. Heraclitus stands out in ancient Greek thought not only for his concepts, but also for the distinctive way he expressed them. His style was aphoristic, filled with wordplay and deliberate ambiguity. He presented a vision of reality made up of opposing forces, a reality whose constant change is what paradoxically keeps it stable. This unique blend of style and philosophy seems to have emerged from an equally unique and perhaps contrary life. While one should be cautious with Diogenes' Laertius' accounts of ancient philosophers, his description of Heraclitus is revealing and fits well with Heraclitus' sharp, sometimes harsh, views. Diogenes Laertius calls him arrogant and proud, citing his harsh criticism of earlier thinkers like Hesiod, Pythagoras, Xenophanes, and Heraclitus, individuals who, he claimed, had gathered much knowledge but understood little. It is said that Heraclitus did not study under anyone, but instead claimed to have learned through solitary inquiry. This image of a solitary thinker matches the impression given by his writings, which suggest a mind shaped by and dependent on solitude. Heraclitus was often critical of the ignorance he perceived in most people, specifically their failure to truly understand. He spoke of a principle, the logos, variously translated as word, reason, rationality, language, or ratio, which the majority fail to grasp both before and after encountering it. Many are asleep even while awake. They hear but do not comprehend. His words echo later sentiments from Plato and Aristotle, who also noted that most people lack nobility of mind, with only a few capable of deeper insight. Heraclitus made a clear distinction between possessing a wealth of information and truly understanding how it all fits together, seeing the meaning behind it, the significance of existence. There is reason to consider that Heraclitus equated God with reality itself, suggesting that a true understanding of the cosmos is a recognition of the sacred. God, for him, embodies all opposites: day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, satiety and hunger. Fire holds a special place in his cosmology. The cosmos was neither created by God nor man, but has always been and will always be fire. Sometimes fire is described as the fundamental element from which all things emerge and to which all return. At other times, it seems metaphorical. Fire represents a balance of opposing forces. It is both need and satisfaction. This dynamic tension is characteristic of life and reality, which cannot exist without conflict and opposition, like war and strife. A path that goes up and down is the same, and those who step into the same river find it ever changing with new waters. Plato, in his dialogue Cratylus, references Heraclitus through Cratylus, saying one cannot step twice into the same river, emphasizing the constant flux of life. Aristotle noted that this idea supposedly led Cratylus to silence, fearing that words might attempt to freeze a constantly changing reality, so he resorted only to gestures. Whether or not this extreme interpretation is accurate, change is undeniably central to Heraclitus' philosophy. Still, Heraclitus understood that, in changing, it remains. The cosmos and all it contains are defined by the tension of becoming. What something is depends on what it is not. The ever-burning fire of the universe is simultaneously at war with itself and at peace, constantly seeking fuel even as it consumes and satisfies. Three key thinkers are generally grouped under Eliatic philosophy: Parmenides, Zeno, and Milesian. While the first two hailed from Elia itself, Milesian did not, yet his ideas clearly continue the monistic tradition established by Parmenides and Zeno. Therefore, Milesian is often discussed alongside them in this context. If Heraclitus viewed life as dynamic, thriving through constant change and movement, even finding rest within that flow, Parmenides presents a stark contrast, seeing life as fundamentally unchanging and still. Originating from Elia, a Greek colony in what is now southern Italy, Parmenides is considered the founder of Eleatic thought and one of the most influential figures among the Presocratics, shaping the course of Western philosophy. According to scholars like McKirahan, Parmenides essentially invented metaphysics, the philosophical investigation into the nature of being and reality. Though his ideas are delivered poetically, they carry the force and rigor of logical argument, setting the groundwork for centuries of philosophical inquiry into the nature of existence and thought. Parmenides' work is structured into three main parts: an introductory section, a discourse on truth, and a section on opinion, what mortals believe. In the poem's allegorical narrative, the speaker recounts a journey in a chariot swiftly drawn by mares, but guided by maidens from the house of night. He arrives at the boundary between the realms of night and day, where justice holds the keys that open the gates between them. The maidens persuade justice to open the door, and beyond it appears a goddess who teaches the only paths valid for thought. One path affirms that what is, and that it is impossible for it not to be. This path belongs to truth and is reliable. The other denies being, claiming that what is not must not be, but this path is entirely unknowable and beyond comprehension, as nothing can be known or spoken of that does not exist. This second path represents opinion, the uncertain beliefs held by mortals. Interestingly, the goddess advises the traveler to learn about both paths, asserting that it is right to understand all things. She acknowledges that although the path of opinion is ultimately mistaken, it is still wise to grasp why many people cling to it. The first path is that of being itself. In Greek, the verb estin is the third-person singular form of to be. Interestingly, it does not require an explicit subject, and in Parmenides' poem, no subject is stated. To make the translation flow naturally in English, translators often supply the word it. Scholars debate the precise sense in which Parmenides uses to be, but several interpretations have been proposed. He might mean it existentially, simply affirming that something exists. Alternatively, it could be predicative, as when stating a quality like, "the shirt is red." Another possibility is that it expresses identity, like an equation A equals B. It could also be used in the sense of truth, as in, "it is true that X." Finally, some combination of these meanings might be intended. Regardless, Parmenides seems focused on the whole of being itself. Once distinctions between different kinds of beings arise, one moves into the realm of opinion and plurality. The correct way to think is to focus solely on what is, while the mistaken way attempts to consider both what is and what is not. This latter path is forbidden by the goddess because non-being simply does not exist. Since there is no non-being, it cannot be genuinely conceived or thought. There is nothing to grasp. Thus, only what is can be thought, and since thinking itself is a form of being, thinking and being are essentially the same. Our confusion arises from deeply ingrained sensory habits that mislead us into the mistaken path of opinion, where we falsely equate being and non-being. The goddess describes several essential qualities of what is. It is ungenerated and cannot perish. It is whole and unified, calm and complete, fully present without any division into past or future, and continuous without gaps. Parmenides employs the principle of sufficient reason to argue that there is no justification for being to have come into existence at one time rather than another. If it had come to be, then there must have been a time when it was not, which is impossible. Therefore, being is necessary. It cannot fail to be. Furthermore, what is immobile, since movement would require passing into non-being, whether by changing place or quality. Being is uniform throughout, and contained within a boundary that encloses it on all sides. Parmenides even likens it to a sphere, balanced and evenly stretched in all directions from its center, making it complete and whole. Although it may seem paradoxical for being to be limited, since this implies there is something beyond it, which would be non-being, we are called to steadfastly conceive of being as a complete totality, despite the common mortal tendency to divide or imagine it enclosed within something else. The goddess then introduces the way of opinion, warning that her words about this path will be deceptive because the subject itself misleads. Mortals claim that both being and non-being exist. We rely heavily on our senses to observe the world, often trusting them more than reason, which insists there is only one true way, being alone. This section complicates interpretations of Parmenides, as it might suggest he gave some validity to mortal opinion. We learn that Parmenides regarded the earth and fire as the fundamental sources of all that exists. Aristotle explains that Parmenides does this to reconcile why reason acknowledges one eternal being, while the senses reveal a multiplicity. Parmenides considered the hot to belong to being, while the cold is associated with non-being. Parmenides recognizes that most people cling to sensory information, even though it is mistaken. This error is subtle and hard to detect. Because we habitually trust our senses, Parmenides seeks to explain why this is so and tries to offer a clearer account of the sensible world. Although this sensory world does not fully reveal his vision of the cosmos, it does suggest some of its features. Heat causes separation, while cold causes things to come together. Beyond these ideas, Parmenides was also a serious astronomer. His astronomical views anticipated some modern ideas. He may have been the first Greek thinker to identify the morning and evening stars as the same object, a knowledge previously known to the Babylonians. He also understood that the moon's light is a reflection of the sun's, rather than being self-generated. Parmenides might even have believed the earth to be spherical. Like being itself, the earth remains balanced and has no reason to move arbitrarily. Parmenides shows deep respect for reason. At a time without telescopes or advanced technology, he transcended appearances to conclude that the morning and evening stars are identical and that the moon shines by reflecting sunlight. This ability to look beyond mere appearances to explain them introduces tension in his thought. No matter how much we trust reason and reject the senses, the sensory world insists on asserting itself, demanding our attention and understanding. Ultimately, this complex sensory experience, which seems to mix being and non-being, may lead us to grasp a unified, eternal, and simple being. Zeno, also from Elea, was a student of Parmenides and possibly more intimately connected to him, reflecting a cultural norm in ancient Greece where intellectual mentorship often included personal relationships. As Daniel Graham explains, while Parmenides argues for monism, the idea that reality is one unified whole, Zeno argues against the existence of many beings. In his writings, Zeno seeks to demonstrate the absurdity of accepting plurality, using logical arguments often in the form of reductio ad absurdum to show that multiple beings cannot consistently exist. By this, he implies that the only viable option is that what truly exists is one singular entity. Additionally, Zeno challenged the notions of motion and place, and his paradoxes have continued to puzzle philosophers and mathematicians through the centuries. Some of Zeno's arguments can be quite intricate. Central to many is an important claim, though the original argument for this claim is lost. Graham summarizes this key idea and its consequences for clarity. If many things exist, none can truly have size because each is identical to itself. Yet, if any did not have size, it would be impossible for it to exist, since adding or removing it would cause no change. Therefore, if there are many things, each must possess size and solidity, and must be composed of smaller parts that also have size and solidity, continuing infinitely. This leads to a paradox where the many would have to be simultaneously infinitely small and infinitely large. These points aim to refute the idea of plurality, though the foundational premise itself remains somewhat obscure. Still, we catch a glimpse of Zeno's overall goal, to deny that reality is composed of many separate things. An argument presented by Plato in his dialogue also touches on this issue. It suggests that if many things exist, each would have to be both similar and different at the same time, resulting in contradiction. For example, one body might be similar to others in occupying space, yet different in color or other qualities. However, this does not strictly produce a contradiction, as similarity and difference can apply in different respects. Zeno further argues that trying to count many things leads to contradiction. If a plurality exists, then their number must be finite, as there would be a specific count. Yet at the same time, the number must be infinite, since between any two things there is always another, endlessly. This means plurality would have to be both finite and infinite simultaneously, an impossibility. A key argument in what remains of Zeno's writings is what the ancients called the argument from dichotomy, which exists in two forms. The first supposes that what is can be divided. From this, two absurd conclusions arise. If what is divisible, it either consists of an infinite number of finite parts, or is divided so thoroughly that nothing remains at all. The first option is somewhat ambiguous, but likely Zeno means that an infinite collection of finite parts would sum to something infinitely large, which contradicts what we observe. The second option is clearly nonsensical. Dividing something endlessly until there is nothing left makes no sense. Thus, Zeno concludes that what truly exists must be one and indivisible. The concept of infinite divisibility underpins many of Zeno's other arguments, including those against motion. Consider the claim that it is impossible for a moving body to cover a given distance. To reach the end, the body must first get halfway there. But to reach that halfway point, it must travel half of that distance first, and before that, half of that half, continuing endlessly. Since space can be divided infinitely, yet we have only a limited amount of time, the body could never complete the journey. Indeed, it could never even start moving. Aristotle later criticized this by pointing out that there are two different meanings of infinite regarding size: infinite divisibility and infinity as an unbounded extent. While one cannot traverse an infinite length in finite time, one can cross a space that is infinitely divisible because time itself is also divisible. If time and space share this infinite divisibility, then motion is possible, with each tiny segment of space matched by a corresponding segment of time. A related argument is known as the Achilles paradox. Here, the fastest runner, Achilles, can never catch the slowest runner who has a head start. Achilles must first reach the point where the slower runner began, but by that time, the slower runner has already moved ahead. When Achilles reaches that new point, the slower runner has advanced further still, and this process repeats indefinitely. Consequently, motion appears impossible. Again, the argument about an arrow flying from one point to another claims that the arrow is not actually moving. At every instant in its apparent flight, the arrow occupies a space equal to its own size. If something occupies a space exactly equal to itself, it must be at rest, since nothing can be moving while occupying such a place. Therefore, the arrow is not truly in motion, but is instead at rest in each position it occupies. Aristotle criticizes this by pointing out that Zeno assumes time is made up of indivisible instants or nows. The arrow is here now, and now here again, repeatedly. Another assumption in Zeno's argument is that something can only be in a place if it is at rest. Zeno also argues against the concept of place itself, stating that if something is in a place, then that place must be located in another place, which itself must be in yet another place, continuing endlessly. From this, Zeno concludes that if everything occupies a place, then there would be an infinite regress of places, which is absurd. One of Zeno's most challenging paradoxes is the stadium or moving rows paradox. Imagine a group of bodies positioned at one end of a racetrack and another group at the opposite end. These groups move in opposite directions at equal speeds, passing by each other as they go. Both also pass by a third group of stationary bodies, each equal in size to the moving ones. The paradox is often explained like this. The two moving groups travel at the same constant speed, starting from the middle stationary group. According to Zeno's reasoning, it should take the moving bodies twice as long to pass each other as it does to pass the stationary ones. This is because one moving group only passes a single stationary body, while it must pass two bodies of the opposing moving group, and vice versa. Hence, the moving groups cover both a longer and shorter distance simultaneously, creating a contradiction. Aristotle counters this by explaining that since both groups are moving at equal speeds, it actually takes half the time for them to pass each other compared to passing a stationary group. Some scholars, doubting Zeno could have made such a mistake, suggest that Zeno might have assumed each body to be indivisible or atomic. If so, a moving body couldn't pass half of another body but must pass it all at once, preserving the paradox. However, there is no direct evidence that Zeno intended this interpretation. The final paradox, known as the millet seed paradox, is either incomplete or flawed. It states that if a large quantity of millet seeds makes a sound when dropped, then a single seed, or even a tiny fraction of one seed, should also make a sound. This clearly does not happen. The problem with this argument is twofold. First, it's unclear what Zeno aimed to prove, and second, it commits the fallacy of division. Just because the whole makes a sound does not mean any small part will as well. Overall, Zeno's paradoxes present a consistent effort to challenge the notions of plurality and motion in defense of the idea that reality is one indivisible whole. We have limited information about Milesius' life, though it is known that he served as an admiral and led a naval engagement against the Athenians. Philosophically, Milesius clearly supports Parmenidean monism but differs from Parmenides in at least two important ways: the nature of the temporality of what is, and whether what is boundless or bounded. Unlike Zeno, Milesius presents a clear and explicit defense of the unity of being. Milesius develops a series of connected and successive arguments. First, being, or what is, cannot have arisen from nothing. Nor could being have come into existence from what is, since that would imply that being already existed prior to coming into being. Similarly, being cannot become non-being. It cannot perish. Therefore, what is must be eternal. Since it neither comes into existence nor ceases to exist, it has no limits and is therefore unlimited, apeiron. From this it follows that being is one. If there were more than one, each would be limited by the other. Consequently, what is must be self-identical and cannot be subject to change, suffering, or any form of alteration. Related to this, what is must be immobile, since motion implies change. There is also no void, since the void would be nothingness, which cannot exist. Without void, motion is impossible, so what is a plenum, a fullness that completely occupies existence. When faced with the objection that we clearly perceive change and flux in the world, Milesius responds by insisting that only one thing follows from his thesis. If elements such as earth, fire, and various metals truly exist, then they must be like the one being. They must always be exactly as they appear. For example, what we call fire is always fire, and what we call earth is always earth. If we think we observe fire cooling down or metal corroding, this is simply a mistaken observation, for they would not change if they were real, but they would remain just such as each appeared to be. Milesius does not clarify why or how our observations deceive us or lead to the illusion of change. He offers no satisfactory explanation for how we come to falsely perceive transformation. According to him, If our observation is accurate and reflects reality, then nothing changes. He maintains a vision of reality in which fundamental elements persist eternally. Though a particular fire may die out, fire itself is never extinguished. Anaxagoras of Clazomenae, who lived shortly before Plato, offered one of the most distinctive views on the nature of matter and the causes behind its formation and decay. His ideas made an impression on both Plato and Aristotle, although they were ultimately dissatisfied with his cosmology. Anaxagoras seems to have focused mainly on cosmology and the fundamental nature of everything around us. Some ancient commentators even called him an atheist, possibly because of his naturalistic explanations of the world. For example, he viewed the sun, moon, and other celestial bodies as fiery stones rather than divine beings. He is also credited with a reasonably accurate explanation of the phenomenon of hail. His method combined observation of the senses with intellectual inquiry into the causes behind appearances. Before the cosmos took its current form, Anaxagoras believed it was nothing more than an immense mixture. Everything was present in everything else. This mixture was so complete that no individual part could be distinguished. Even color was imperceptible because the parts were so minuscule. He held that matter is infinitely divisible, meaning there is no ultimate smallest part. If there were such a smallest part, it could not be divided further without ceasing to exist. The infinitely divisible components appeared to be mixtures of elemental qualities such as earth, wet and dry, hot and cold, and what he called seeds, sperma. The exact nature of these seeds is uncertain. They may have been the origins of generation or small fragments of elemental substances. Regardless, all these seeds and elements were combined before separation occurred. This great mixture began to separate due to a powerful, high-speed centrifugal spin. The force and rapid motion of this spinning caused different beings to separate from one another. However, this separation was not a complete purification. Beings in the world remain mixtures. In fact, everything still contains parts of everything else. What distinguishes a thing, such as gold, is that it contains more of a certain element than others. For instance, a gold coin is considered gold because gold predominates within it. How something small like a coin can contain bits of everything, however, remains unexplained in the surviving fragments of Anaxagoras' thought. Anaxagoras teaches that the processes of mixture and separation never stop. What we call generation is simply the act of mixing, while what appears to be perishing is actually separation. This perspective carries significant implications for how we understand human mortality. According to Anaxagoras' principles, change into non-being, what we call death, is impossible. Instead, death can be seen as the breaking apart of the components that made up a particular body, which then return to the larger mixture of the earth. Similarly, birth cannot be creation from nothing. It begins as a mixture of seeds, which themselves are mixtures of other things. Nothing can come into existence from what does not already exist. Therefore, generation depends on what already is. Anaxagoras envisions the world as an ongoing interplay of being. Like the Eliatics, he insists that being is necessary and cannot simply cease to be. Also like them, he recognizes that the senses do not provide a fully accurate picture of reality. Instead, reason must guide us to understand the true nature of the world. But unlike the Eleatics, Anaxagoras accepts that change and natural processes are real, not mere illusions of the senses. One crucial element in this continuous play of being is mind, or nous. Mind can be present within things, but nothing else can be mixed with mind. It is completely unmixed. Since everything else is mixed with everything, if mind were mixed with anything, then everything would be mixed with mind, which would prevent mind from ruling over all. Mind, therefore, stands apart and remains pure. It is mind that initiates the spinning of the great mixture, causing the separation that brings forth individual beings. This eternal mind, the finest and most pure entity, is responsible for ordering the cosmos. Thus, Anaxagoras does not present the world as a chaotic cycle of mixture and separation, but as a process governed and organized by unmixed mind. Anaxagoras influenced both Plato and Aristotle, though both expressed similar criticisms. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates recounts his fascination with Anaxagoras' concept of mind as the ultimate cause. However, Socrates also criticizes Anaxagoras for using mind sparingly, offering little explanation about why the heavenly bodies move as they do or what good comes from things being the way they are. Aristotle, likewise, argued that Anaxagoras relied on mind only as a fallback explanation, a kind of deus ex machina, whenever no other cause could be found. It is possible, however, that both Plato and Aristotle somewhat misrepresented Anaxagoras to strengthen their own views. After all, Anaxagoras' idea of mind setting the great mixture into motion and organizing the cosmos remains a profound philosophical achievement. We possess a substantial poem from Empedocles of Anaxagoras, a city near Sicily. He lived during the same era as Anaxagoras and Socrates, and much of his life is wrapped in legend, making it difficult to separate fact from myth. Philosophically, Empedocles embraced a principle similar to that of Parmenides, asserting that what exists cannot fail to exist. In the political realm, he was known as a supporter of democracy. Religiously, he appeared to align with Pythagorean beliefs, promoting a specific dietary practice and endorsing the idea of the transmigration of souls. Empedocles was said to be a physician with interests in magic and prophecy. According to accounts, he once sustained a woman who neither breathed nor ate for an extended period. He reportedly proclaimed himself divine, dressing in purple robes, bronze sandals, and a golden wreath. To demonstrate his godhood, it is said that he cast himself into the volcanic crater of Mount Etna, symbolically purifying himself from his mortal body. Despite these legendary stories, a considerable portion of his poetic work survives, even if parts of it remain obscure or difficult to interpret. At its core, the cosmos is made up of four fundamental elements or roots, accompanied by two forces that govern their combining and separating. Empedocles was the first to identify these elements as earth, air, fire, and water. The force called love unites these elements and the things that arise from them, while strife acts to tear them apart. In his work, Empedocles describes an endless cycle where unity arises from multiplicity through the influence of love, and multiplicity emerges from unity through strife. Although these names might suggest moral qualities, love as good and strife as bad, Empedocles treated them as natural, morally neutral forces responsible for the ongoing motion of existence. Similar to Anaxagoras' idea of mixture, love, when dominant, holds all things in perfect unity. As strife gains influence, this unity breaks down, giving rise to the distinct beings we see around us. Importantly, Empedocles makes clear that these cycles do not involve creation from nothing or complete destruction into nothingness. Being, or what is eternal and cannot cease to be. Nothing comes from non-existence, nor does anything vanish into it. Humans simply err when they speak of birth and death as absolute beginnings and ends. For Empedocles, such terms are conventional, masking the eternal reality beneath. Love and strife are not only responsible for the unity and division of elements, but continue to operate in the world as it exists now. Through a perpetual interplay, some things are drawn together by love, while others are driven apart by strife. Certain things blend easily, while others separate more readily. Empedocles compares this to painters mixing colors in varying degrees to create a picture. Likewise, love and strife, like the painters, combine and divide the primal elements. Everything that has ever existed, exists now, or will exist, owes its being to the ongoing dance of these two forces. The exact mechanism of this mixture and separation remains somewhat mysterious. Empedocles describes a vortex, When love is at its center, all things are unified, drawn from their separate places to come together in harmony. At the same time, strife retreats to the periphery. When strife regains power, separation occurs. Air or ether breaks away first, followed by fire, then earth, and finally water flows out from earth due to the pressure of celestial movements. When the elements are fully separated, the world as we know it ceases to be recognizable. According to Empedocles, our current reality is one where love and strife both operate in balance, neither dominating the other. Although Empedocles is best known for his grand metaphysical vision of the cosmos, he also explored ideas on a smaller, physical scale. He believed that different kinds of flesh arise from distinct mixtures of the four elements. For humans, sharper perception and intelligence come from a more balanced blend of these elements. In fact, perception and intelligence appear to be closely linked. The more sensitive a creature is to the world around it, the more intelligent it tends to be. Empedocles also proposed that thought is connected to blood circulation, pinpointing the area near the heart as the center of thinking. This might relate to his ideas about breathing. Inhalation happens as blood pulls away from certain tubes, likely in the nose, allowing air to fill them, and when blood returns, it pushes the air back out. Perception itself, according to Empedocles, happens when certain effluences, or particles from an object, travel through a medium like air or water and enter the pores of our senses. Each sense organ's pores are specialized, so one sense cannot detect the object of another. For example, eyes seem to contain a form of light or fire and emit a certain amount of light, while ears receive sound through vibrations in the air that strike the inner ear and create echoes. Empedocles' personal identity is somewhat ambiguous. At times, he calls himself a fugitive from the gods. At other moments, he claims to be a divine figure speaking truth. He describes being revered by both men and women in flourishing cities, and questions why he urges these teachings if he is superior to mortal men who repeatedly perish. There is a sense that he viewed himself as a fallen god, while humanity has generally fallen from divinity. He supported a belief in the transmigration of souls, where reincarnation depends on the purity of one's life. It is uncertain whether such purity guarantees salvation or a return to divinity, but physical, spiritual, and intellectual purity seem to bring one closest to the divine. After a fast from wickedness, people become prophets, hymn-singers, healers, and leaders among mortals, and eventually they bloom as honored gods. Throughout all of this, the forces of love and strife remain the ruling powers guiding the cycles of existence. Ancient atomism laid a foundational legacy for both philosophical and scientific thought, which was later revived and developed further in modern philosophy. While today we know the atom is not the smallest particle, the original meaning of the term atomos is something uncut or indivisible. The early atomists, especially Leucippus and Democritus, were focused on identifying the smallest particles of nature that constitute reality, particles that are both indivisible and invisible. Their ideas partly responded to Parmenides and Zeno, who argued that the world is indivisible and motionless, by proposing that atoms are the indivisible sources of motion. Since little survives from Leucippus, attention mainly centers on Democritus. Although he was said to be prolific, producing numerous works, only fragments of his writings on atomism remain. What is clear is that Democritus believed reality consists of two fundamental states, the full and the empty, or what is and what is not. Interestingly, he asserted that these two states hold equal ontological status. Each is as real as the other. This view aligns with interpretations by Aristotle, suggesting that both body, the full, and void exist equally, with neither having greater being. Atoms, the smallest and indivisible bodies in nature, are infinite in number and move endlessly through an infinite void. Democritus emphasized that motion would be impossible without the void, as atoms require empty space through which to move. Atoms take on countless shapes. Some are round, others hooked or jagged. They constantly collide and bounce off one another. Yet when their shapes fit together, atoms combine to create the matter we experience as the sensible world. This combination is only possible because of the surrounding void, which acts as a necessary backdrop. Atoms remain joined until external forces separate them, after which they resume their endless motion. Why atoms come together to form worlds seems a matter of chance, but many worlds have formed, exist now, and will continue to form through atomic collisions and unions. Once a world is formed, however, everything that happens within it follows necessity, governed by the causal laws of nature. The basic distinctions among atoms and the things they compose arise from figure, order, and position, or, as Leucippus and Democritus put it, contour, contact, and rotation. These characteristics determine which atoms unite to form elemental bodies such as fire and water. It is crucial to understand, though, that atoms themselves do not change. They are immutable. The visible world emerges through their combinations, and when things perish, it is due to the dispersal of these atoms. Atoms play a key role not only in the physical world, but also in sense perception and thought. Specific shapes of atoms correspond to particular tastes. For instance, round atoms produce sweetness, whereas rough and angular atoms result in sour flavors. The sense of touch operates on a similar principle. However, sight, hearing, and smell can be seen as variations or extensions of touch. Objects emit what are called effluences, subtle particles or flows, that travel through mediums like air or water to reach our sense organs. For example, we see a tree because its atomic form sends out effluences that enter the eye and interact with its atoms, carrying an image of the tree inside. This raises questions about how effluences from large objects, such as buildings, can fit into something as small as the eye, but it is possible that these effluences are condensed before entering the sensory organ. Democritus' understanding of perception has significant implications for his theory of knowledge. Since what we perceive are only effluences from things, we never directly perceive the things themselves. Therefore, our knowledge is limited to appearances rather than things as they are in themselves. According to Democritus, the only ultimate realities are atoms and void. Everything else is a matter of opinion and convention. While certain atoms correspond to specific tastes, even this is relative and conventional. What tastes sweet to one person might taste bitter to another, depending on how the atoms of the object interact with the atoms of the perceiver. He famously said that qualities like bitterness, heat, cold, and color are all conventional. In reality, there exist only atoms and void. Our understanding is limited, and what we perceive is really just changes relative to our bodily condition as objects interact with us. Even the human soul, for Democritus, is a particular configuration of atoms, and while we cannot fully know much, we are capable of thought. This perspective influenced later skepticism, although Democritus was not a complete skeptic since he believed atoms and void could be known. Though little of his physical theory survives, much of Democritus' ethical thought comes to us through brief sayings focused on contentment and freedom from disturbance. Well-being arises from being content and undisturbed, achieved by pursuing what is truly beneficial for oneself. The measure of benefit is found in pleasure and pain, or joy and sorrow. However, Democritus does not endorse sensual hedonism. True pleasure is not merely physical or momentary. Those who indulge excessively in food, drink, or sex experience only fleeting pleasure followed by much pain. In contrast, intellectual pleasures, those drawn from reason, are deeper and more lasting. Reason derives joy from itself, and this intellectual pleasure is the best indicator of a good life. Echoing Heraclitus, Democritus valued the life of thought over mere knowledge of many things, and good actions over empty talk about goodness. Fools leave their lives to chance, while the wise plan and act with intelligence. This connection between his physical and ethical views is clear. If the soul is made of atoms, then learning, teaching, and thoughtful reflection can reshape the soul and protect us from random fortune. Pleasure and pain are central to his ethics, but the highest pleasures are those of wisdom and understanding. Merely controlling desires is not enough. True goodness involves avoiding not only wrongdoing but even the desire for it. Seeking physical pleasures leads to disorder and suffering, while pursuing intellectual joys brings harmony and cheerfulness to life. Next in line of the Presocratics in our discussion is Diogenes of Apollonia. Details about Diogenes' life remain largely unknown, though it is thought he was active sometime in the middle or later part of the 5th century. What is clear is that he revived the idea of material monism, proposing air as the fundamental element, much like Anaximenes before him. However, unlike Anaximenes, Diogenes explicitly explained why there must be a single essential substance underlying all things. He asserted that all existing things are transformations of the same underlying reality, and that they are fundamentally one. This principle was presented as an unquestionable starting point. Without a common nature shared among all things, nothing could combine or interact. For instance, plants could not grow from the earth if there were no shared essence. What appears as diversity in the world is merely different states or variations of the same being. The entire cosmos is a continuous process of change within a single unified substance. Air is chosen as this fundamental being because it is essential for life. Since all animals, including humans, depend on breathing, air naturally becomes associated with life itself. In keeping with tradition, Diogenes identified air with the soul or the vital principle of living beings. When breathing stops, the soul or life departs from the body. In this framework, soul, life, and air are essentially the same. Moreover, air is linked to intelligence. Without breath, intelligence disappears. As intelligence, air governs and directs everything, acting as a divine force that pervades all things, organizing and sustaining the cosmos. Everything contains air, but not in an identical way. Air and intelligence exist in many forms. Sometimes air is warmer or colder, drier or wetter, more still or more active, and it exhibits countless subtle variations in flavor, color, and other qualities. These differences range from the obvious to the barely perceptible. Diogenes also pointed out that no two distinct things can become exactly alike without losing their individuality and becoming the same thing. If two things are identical, they cannot be separate or distinguished from one another. While the cosmos contains many diverse beings, their underlying nature remains unified. This unity allows for varying degrees of life and intelligence across different beings. Thus, Diogenes does not restrict intelligence solely to humans, but suggests that other beings might possess it in different measures. Air serves as the eternal substance that sustains the cosmos, enabling both diversity and intelligence in all things. The modern use of the term sophistry, much like cynic and stoic, traces back to a philosophical school active in roughly 5th century Greece. Just as we cannot reduce cynicism or stoicism to their contemporary stereotypes, we should not reduce sophist thought simply to the negative sense that sophistry now often carries. It has been common to interpret the Presocratic thinkers through the perspectives of Plato and Aristotle, and the same applies to the Sophists. Indeed, Plato named 2 dialogues after prominent Sophists, Protagoras and Gorgias, and another is titled simply The Sophist. Many key sophistic ideas appear in Plato's work, including the similarities between Socrates and the Sophists, a topic he explicitly discusses in the Apology and other texts. Clearly, the Sophists played a significant role in shaping 5th century Greek intellectual life. Generally, the Sophists were traveling educators who charged fees to teach a variety of subjects, with rhetoric being their main focus. A distinctive feature among many Sophists was their skill in arguing both sides of an issue, a useful ability in legal and political settings. However, this emphasis on rhetorical versatility contributed to their reputation as moral and epistemological relativists, a reputation that led some to accuse them of intellectual dishonesty. One of the earliest and best-known Sophists was Protagoras, though only fragments of his thought survive, and much of what we know comes from Plato's portrayals, which require careful interpretation. Protagoras is famous for the claim that humans are the measure of all things, of those that are, that they are, and of those that are not, that they are not. Plato interprets this as an expression of individual relativism. For example, if Henry finds water cold, then it is cold for Henry, but if Jennifer finds it warm, then it is warm for her. This example illustrates perceptual relativism, which extends to ethics. If something seems good to Henry, it is good for him, though it may appear bad to Jennifer. The difficulty with this view is that if all judgments are relative to the individual, then even the claim that all things are relative becomes relative, undermining the possibility of meaningful communication. Alternatively, Protagoras' statement can be understood as species relative. Questions about how things are or are not only make sense from a human perspective. In this view, knowledge is always relative to humans and limited by human capacities. This fits with another of Protagoras' well-known remarks concerning the gods. He admits he cannot determine whether gods exist, nor what form they might have, due to the difficulty of the question and the shortness of human life. This suggests that while knowledge is possible, it is challenging and sometimes unattainable, especially in matters such as divine existence. Human finitude limits not only our lifespan, but also the extent of our knowledge. Therefore, if knowledge exists, it belongs to humans but remains obscure and fragile. Not long after Protagoras, Gorgias emerged as a notable figure, perhaps even more flamboyant in his rhetorical style and public speaking. Renowned for his polished and poetic delivery, Gorgias was famous for delivering impromptu speeches based on topics suggested by his audience. His most famous work, On Nature or On What Is Not, challenges Eleatic philosophy by arguing that neither being nor non-being exists, and even if something did exist, it could neither be known nor expressed in speech. The core argument of On Nature unfolds by considering the possibilities that if anything exists, it must be either purely being, purely non-being, or a combination of both. Gorgias systematically dismisses each option. He starts with non-being. If non-being were, it would be contradictory because it would both exist and not exist simultaneously. Further, if non-being existed, then being would not, but non-being would paradoxically possess the quality of being, while being would have the property of non-being, which is absurd. Turning to being, Gorgias argues it cannot simply exist. If being existed eternally, it would have no limits, yet for anything to exist, it must occupy a particular place, distinct from what it occupies. Being cannot be generated because if it came from something that exists, it already existed, and if it came from non-being, that would be impossible. The idea that being is both eternal and generated is contradictory, since something eternal cannot be brought into existence, and something generated cannot be eternal. Gorgias also claims that even if something existed, it could not be known or thought. For something to be the object of thought, it must exist, yet if all objects of thought were things that actually exist, then fantastical beings like unicorns or centaurs would exist simply because we can imagine them, which is clearly not the case. Since we can conceive of things that do not exist, objects of thought cannot be equated with actual beings. Finally, even if we could think of what truly exists, we would be unable to communicate it. Our perception of objects, like tables, songs, or scents, relies on different senses such as sight, sound, and smell. Communication, however, depends on speech, which is not the same as the objects perceived. When we speak about a table or a song, we do not transmit the actual table or song to another person, but only words representing them. Just as a visual experience cannot become a sound, a thing perceived cannot become speech, and vice versa. Whether Gorgias' arguments were playful demonstrations or sincere philosophical claims remains unknown. If earnest, however, his conclusions leave us in a silent world, one beyond comprehension. Very little information survives about Antiphon the Sophist. He appears to have been known for his courtroom speeches, interpretations of dreams, and even claims to cure depression. His most notable ideas concern justice and law, as reflected in the fragments that remain. According to Antiphon, justice is essentially about obeying the laws of the city where one lives, but only when others are watching. When alone, however, he suggests it is better to follow the works of nature, since laws are artificial while natural things are necessary. The tension between law or custom, nomos, and nature, physis, was a central debate among ancient Greek thinkers, especially the Sophists. Antiphon clearly opposes law to nature, though it is unclear what exactly he means by works of nature. His views can be interpreted as supporting a kind of hedonism, where what brings pleasure is truly beneficial because it aligns with nature, while what causes pain is disadvantageous. If we understand Antiphon as a hedonist, it would be a moderated form that distinguishes between good and bad pleasures. For instance, he downplays sexual pleasure, noting that it rarely comes alone but is often accompanied by sorrow and pain. He also critiques greed, cautioning against hoarding wealth. One story he tells involves a man whose hidden money was stolen. A friend advised him not to despair, but to place a stone where the money had been and imagine he still possessed it, since he had never actually used the money even when it was there. The lesson is clear. If one earns money, one should use it. Money stored away serves little purpose. Additionally, Antiphon warns against harming one's neighbor, as wrongdoing inevitably brings harm back to the wrongdoer. He emphasizes discipline as crucial, stating that nothing is worse than a lack of it, and urges proper upbringing of children so that they can face life's challenges without being overwhelmed. Thus, if Antiphon's philosophy is hedonistic, it is one that promotes what is genuinely advantageous for oneself, a practical and wise hedonism rather than a reckless pursuit of pleasure. Prodicus of Ceos, like many Sophists, was both a teacher and rhetorician. Similar to Protagoras, he challenged traditional theistic beliefs but went further in his critique. The ancient Greeks and Egyptians often regarded all things that benefit life as gods. For example, the sun, moon, rivers, springs, and generally anything that sustains life were considered divine, much like the Egyptians viewed the Nile as a god because of its life-giving qualities. This perspective doesn't necessarily make Prodicus an atheist in the modern sense. The ancient use of the term covered both those who denied gods entirely and those who held unconventional views about them, but it certainly questioned the common belief that gods exist independently of human judgment. Plato depicts Prodicus as a master of precise language. In the dialogue Cratylus, Socrates remarks that studying words is no trivial matter, and jokes that if he had attended Prodicus' expensive lecture promising complete instruction on correct diction, he would be able to explain everything perfectly. Unfortunately, Socrates says, he only heard the cheaper, shorter lecture. This light-hearted comment reflects Plato's critique of Sophists charging large fees for their teaching. Similarly, in the Hippias Major, Plato comments on how much money Prodicus earned by giving public displays and educating young men. However, as some scholars note, Prodicus' skill in distinguishing subtle differences in words was significant for rhetoric, especially in a time before dictionaries existed. His writings can be seen as early contributions to lexicography and the study of diction, while Plato tends to portray Prodicus with a mix of respect and satire, partly to highlight the contrast with Socrates, who claimed to teach for free and knew nothing. Prodicus' ideas may have been more influential than Plato allows. Two anonymous works, known as the Anonymous Iamblichi and the Dissoi Logoi, illustrate opposite ends of sophistic thought. The Anonymous Iamblichi is mainly concerned with ethics, focusing on reputation, virtue, and law. It encourages cultivating virtue from a young age, arguing that prolonged familiarity with a practice strengthens it, while a brief exposure cannot achieve the same effect. Living a virtuous life demands self-control, especially a detachment from money, which corrupts everyone. The love of money, for most, stems from fear of death, illness, aging, and so forth. People believe money can protect them from these inevitable realities. Additionally, rivalry, and competition fuel greed. Therefore, laws are necessary to ensure that wealth benefits the entire community and to prevent societal collapse. Without law, greed leads to chaos and tyranny. Hence, virtue and law are deeply intertwined. In contrast, the dissoi logoi, or twofold arguments, is a sophistic exercise exploring the relativity of concepts such as good and bad, right and wrong, justice and injustice, truth and falsehood. What may be good in one context could be bad in another, or good for one person but harmful to another. For instance, illness is harmful to the patient but beneficial to the physician. Similarly, death is tragic for those who die but profitable for undertakers and tomb makers. The text also highlights how moral values vary between cultures. Among the Spartans, it is acceptable for girls to exercise nude or wear sleeveless clothing in public, while the Ionians consider this improper. Likewise, the Thracians regard tattoos on girls as marks of beauty, whereas other cultures see them as punishments for crimes. This cultural relativism challenges the idea of universal morality. If all values depend on custom, then no action can be declared universally right or wrong. While the arguments in the dissoi logoi often seem weak, they likely represent typical sophistic exercises rather than the views of the more accomplished Sophists. Looking more broadly from the earliest Presocratic thinkers through the Sophists, there is wide diversity in both content and style. Yet common themes emerge. On one hand, many thinkers sought to understand the cosmos on its own terms, moving away from traditional, God-centered explanations. On the other hand, several reinterpreted ideas of God and divinity. A growing interest in ethics and human affairs appears as well, focusing on how people ought to live. Underpinning all this is a commitment to free, rational inquiry.